Hello everyone, my name is Orla Nicantilla and I'm the Digital Communications Coordinator at Carlow College St Patrick's. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture in the Leaving Cert lecture series, From Gods to Man, From Myth to Reason, Ancient Greek Philosophy and the Birth of Reason. Speaking today is Carlow College lecturer in philosophy, Dr. Noel Kavanagh. Noel's research interests are in ancient Greek and medieval philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and culture. For today's lecture, if you have any questions during the lecture, please put these via the Q&A button at the bottom of the website, and we put these questions to Noel to answer at the end of the lecture. We'll also be publishing the full lecture on YouTube, and we will send a link along with the lecture slides to all attendees. Now I'd like to hand over to Noel.
Hi guys, how are you? Welcome and thank you for turning up to listen to me, as the fella says. I had entitled this lecture From Gods to Men, From Myth to Reason, for a reason as such. And what I want to do today is I want to focus on an extraordinary period of ancient Greek culture and thinking that would have ultimately its ramifications far wider than ancient Greece, because it is in some ways the birth of critical reasoning and the birth of philosophy. And what we're going to look at is, in some ways, the attempt, and why I call the talk From Gods to Men, is that at some point in time around 600 BC in Greece, and particularly in a very, very small, out of the way place called Miletus, and Miletus is it would have been a small, if you want, small provincial coastal town on the coast of what we now would know as Turkey. If you've ever been to Bodrum in Turkey, it's not that far from Bodrum. And the question becomes then, why is it that the birthplace of Greek philosophy is in this place called Miletus, not at the center of things, say in Athens or Sparta or the high, if you want, the high centers of Greek culture, but in a small, out of the way regional place? And we'll get around to that as we go. But we see, as I said, in around 600 BC moving forward, we have what we call the birth of pre-Socratic philosophy. Now, why is it called pre-Socratic philosophy? Well, it's called pre-Socratic philosophy because, essentially speaking, it is before Socrates. And ancient Greek thinking is divided into two sections in some ways: the philosophy before Socrates and the philosophy after. Now, unfortunately, today we're not going to be able to get into. I'd love to come back at some point in time and talk to you about why there's a shift in thinking from pre-Socratic to post-Socratic philosophy. But as I say, that's for another day. But what we have in pre-Socratic philosophy is a whole bunch of philosophers in Miletus and the surrounding areas emerging with a revolutionary new idea. And these group of thinkers began a revolution, and the revolution was in the way we think about the world. In order to perhaps kind of demonstrate and kind of lead into my conversation, we might go to a little video clip. And this video clip is from the introduction to, most of you won't know it, it's a 1980s, 90s, very, very cheesy, kitschy TV series called The Continuing Adventures of Hercules. But I'd like you to listen to the very opening lines of this story. If you want to go there, go ahead.
This is the story of a time long ago, a time of myth and legend, when the ancient gods were petty and cruel, and they plagued mankind with suffering. Only one man dared to challenge their power: Hercules. Hercules possessed a strength the world had never seen, a strength surpassed only by the power of his heart. He journeyed the earth, battling the minions of his wicked stepmother Hera, the all-powerful queen of the gods. But wherever there was evil, wherever an innocent would suffer, there would be Hercules.
Now, now we see from the very, very start of that, as I said, that very, very cheesy TV series Hercules, the legendary journeys, is that we see the very, very first lines of that. It tells us that there was the world of the gods was a world in which the gods were petty, cruel, vindictive, and that they plagued mankind. And I suppose what these new bunch of Greek philosophers were doing was beginning to understand, to maybe even suggest that the world of the gods, that great Homeric tradition of classical studies that you would have all been learning, that wasn't acceptable anymore. That the world of chance, the world of haphazardness, the world of chaos was unpredictable, then ultimately there was no meaning to be had. And these early philosophers were doing was attempting then to put meaning on their lives by looking to the nature of the universe and to what we might now know as physics as something that was a place of rationality, not a place of chaos. So if you go back to, and I'm sure you've done it with your classical studies, the Homeric epics. So you're talking about the Odyssey or the Iliad, in particular the Odyssey. The Odyssey is entirely a story of the gods messing with Odysseus, messing with his attempt to get home, and Odysseus becomes, in some ways, the collateral damage between rows between gods. And ultimately, then, you're not in the early Greek philosophers were suggesting that that wasn't good enough anymore because that takes human agency, right? And what I mean by human agency is control of our lives. So what we see in ancient Greek, the birth of ancient Greek philosophy in Miletus is the very, very beginning of philosophers looking at the universe not in a way in which there was chaos and haphazardness, and that your lives weren't in your own control because you were ultimately at the mercy of the gods. And those gods, by the way, weren't even nice gods. They were cruel, as the opening passage of the video shows. They were cruel, vindictive, petty. All of the worst traits of humankind were were the traits of the gods. And therefore these ancient Greek philosophers began to think to themselves, well, that's not good enough anymore. Now, why they did this is in some ways, again, a much bigger story that we can't go into today. But we can see that from about 600 BC onwards, that a small group of philosophers, and if you can see from the slide there with the map, you can see where Miletus is where now we would call modern Turkey. And I suppose in some ways we can understand that, it depends on where you're looking from, because if that is, we would see that maybe if you're talking about the center of Greek culture being, say, Athens and Sparta and Macedonia, that somewhere like Miletus was out of the way. But if you look at it from a different perspective, where Miletus is on the outskirts of the Greek world, but it's also a point in which there is trade coming from all over the world, all over the known world. So what they're doing is they're receiving new ideas. And perhaps, and one of the great stories, I suppose, of modern research about the nature of Greek philosophy is the Greek philosophy perhaps isn't that Greek in the sense that they were importing ideas from elsewhere, because your teachers would say to you that travel broadens the mind. And why does it broaden the mind? Well, you go to different places on your holidays and you see how from small things to the way people eat, the way people drink, whether the people socialize, that there's a different world view. Well, take that even further, from the small stuff to the big stuff. They're probably sitting in Miletus, this port town, this trading town, and they're getting people from the Middle East, the Far East, all over the known world at the time, even from as far away as India or China, probably, in terms of trade, and they're getting new ideas. And those ideas maybe were the stirrings for these Greek philosophers to say, well, hold on, other people in different places in the world believe different things. Most importantly, they were getting mathematics and the birth of science, because these early Greek philosophers, what we might term as the Milesians from Miletus, these thinkers began to reject the very notion that our lives were controlled by the gods, that they were controlled, and therefore we had no, as I say, human agency. We had no control over our lives, and that in some ways they were looking to take control. One of the very first philosophers we encounter in that period, and he's understood to be the first recorded Greek philosopher, is a philosopher called Thales. Now, Thales, we know from different sources, lived from 624 to 545 BC in Miletus. Now, we are left with nothing from Thales in terms of what we know he said, because there are none of his writings left, none of his philosophy is left. So what we get is second, third hand, fourth hand information from other sources. But what we do know is that he predicted an eclipse. Now, it seems nothing, right? So he predicted an eclipse. So what does that mean? But how can you predict something? How could you predict? So you are say you know where to go for your class tomorrow morning in school. Why do you know that? Why can you predict that you'll go to a room at a certain time and see a certain teacher, and that certain teacher will teach you certain things? Well, that's because there's a timetable. And because there's a timetable, there's a certain level of predictability. So what that tells us, that Thales was able to predict an eclipse, was that he was beginning to view the world in a way that wasn't random. He was able to predict it because he was looking at the world, he was looking at the universe as such, in terms of it portraying a rational, ordered, systematic place. And he would have understood that in some ways as being a revolutionary act. Why is it a revolutionary act? Because he's rejecting the gods. No, I can predict an eclipse because this is systematic and this is ordered. And if there's a system and an order and a pattern, I can predict what's happening next. So the very idea that he was able to predict an eclipse is an early hint for us that these early Greek philosophers were beginning to think differently about the world. They were beginning to think about the world as a systematic and ordered place, not a place of chaos, not a place in which their lives were controlled by the gods who were petty, cruel, and vindictive. So what else do we know about Thales? Well, what we know about Thales is that Thales, and this is what we get this from Aristotle, one of the great later Greek thinkers. Aristotle tells us that Thales said that everything was water. Now, that's a very rudimentary understanding of the nature of the universe. And sometimes we would think to ourselves, when we read the ancient Greek philosophers, we kind of go, because Thales is going to say water, Anaximander, who will do in a little bit, is going to say earth, air, fire, and water. And we'll all, we can look at it, I suppose, from the 21st century eyes, look back at it and say that they were kind of rudimentary and sometimes kind of naive on first glance. But I suppose they were naive, I suppose, and rudimentary because they were the first stirring. So if you think of the analogy, the Wright brothers invented the airplane in the 1800s in Midwest America. Now, the Wright brothers didn't gather their friends and relatives around the day that they were going to fly the first airplane and open up the big barn and drag out a 747. No, they didn't. And why didn't they? Because flight had to evolve. In the same way, thought has to evolve. So what we're dealing with these early philosophers is sometimes very rudimentary, sometimes quite naive understandings of the nature of the universe, but they were the first stirrings. And what we see as we go through ancient Greek philosophy, so when we go from, say, Thales, who we have as the first recorded philosopher, to Plato and Aristotle, very highly sophisticated philosophers, later on down the line, 300 years later, we see an increased sophistication of the ideas. So as we go along, we see them getting more complex, more sophisticated, and more insightful about the nature of the universe. So Thales, come back to Thales. What did Thales say? Well, Thales said that that everything was water, that the universe, the stuff of the universe, was water, and that ultimately the earth rested on a cosmic sea of water. Now, if we go to the slide that has the Greek god holding up the first one, I think, or there we go. There we have it. There's the ultimate picture of the nature of, in some ways, Greek mythology, that the world is being held up by a god, and that ultimately the explanations for everything were due to him and his understanding of the nature of the universe and his rows with other gods. But what we have in Thales is Thales is telling us that Earth is held up by a sea of cosmic water. So space, in some ways, is water. Now, why is that important? Well, it's kind of naive on one level, but we'll come back to that in a second. Why it's naive on one level is that we know that that's not true. But the most important thing we can understand with Thales when he says that is that it's now depersonified. And what I mean by that is it's no longer a god or a person or someone condemned by the gods to hold up the world. It is now water. It's a natural substance. And if it's a natural substance, it is understood to be at the behest of natural laws. So we haven't even got to the idea of the articulation of a set of natural laws, but Thales is the very first. Him saying it, the universe, the world is held up by a cosmic sea of water, is the very, very first step to us understanding the idea of what he will call phusis, the phusis of the world, right? Where we get the word physics. So Thales is the first recorded Greek philosopher that we have that is beginning to look at the universe in terms of not chaos, not unpredictability of the unpredictability caused by a series of gods. It is ultimately down to water, a depersonified thing. And water does what water does when water does what it does in some ways, right? And what I mean by that is to the laws of nature. So, and we see this with Anaximander, but we'll look at that in a minute. But think about it. Water will turn you stick out, you come off, your teachers go on later on and have a cup of tea later on in the staff room, or you go and have a coffee or whatever, a cup of tea in a coffee shop after school, and you put the kettle on, or they'll look to boil water. When does water boil? Does it boil at the behest of the gods? Does it boil randomly? No, water boils when it reaches the optimum temperature. Not before, not after. And Thales is beginning to articulate that sort of systematic, because remember, he predicts an earthquake. You can predict when your kettle is going to boil. Why? Because the laws of nature dictate that when water reaches a certain temperature, it'll boil and turn to steam. Not before, not after, not because a God wants it to, not because a God can't be arsed, so it happens later on. It's by the order of nature. So what we have with Thales saying that everything is water is a hugely important point in the development of Western thinking, because it is the very, very first stirrings of the idea of physics, of order, of these philosophers looking at the world in a different way, looking at the world as an ordered and systematic place. And the argument is that bounce forward to the 16th, 17th century, to the Renaissance, when these philosophers and scientists were beginning to articulate, so Newton later on than the race, trying to articulate the nature of the laws of nature, begins with Thales, begins in Miletus with Thales, trying to look at the world as not a place that is at the behest of the gods, but it is a place of reason and order. And if there's a reason and order to something, then you can predict it. So this morning, when you woke up, you got up, you had your breakfast, you changed, you got into your school uniforms or whatever you're wearing, and you headed off to school. Not once did you think to yourself, oh, I wonder, is the school going to be open? Oh, I wonder, is my teacher going to turn up? I wonder, is anybody else going to turn up? I wonder, is the electricity going to be on? None of these things entered your head. Why? Because we live in an ordered world of system and predictability through the laws of nature that underpin all of those things. And if we look at it, Thales, and I said there just a few minutes ago that Thales was, we could see him as being naive, and we could see his philosophy as being rudimentary. But in the end of the day, Thales identified that the building blocks of the entire universe were water, that everything was ultimately water. Now, if we think about it, a few years ago, they sent a probe to Mars, and the Mars lander kind of landed on Mars and went around collecting samples. And everyone, NASA and the whole world, got really, really excited. Why? Because they discovered something that they understood was the necessary constituent building blocks of all existence, all life: water. So discovering water on Mars was a huge leap forward. So in some ways, Thales is not that far off. Everything is ultimately water. And remember, Thales is sitting there no doubt on the dock of Miletus. It's a very arid, warm climate. He knows water is important. Water brings life, brings crops. Without water, we would soon perish. So water is ultimately, so in some ways he was even very astute about the nature of the building blocks of the universe. In actual fact, Aristotle reports that Thales said that all human life began when animals came out of the water. Now, evolutionary biologists will tell you all life probably began with fish that came out of the water. So in some ways, Thales is more on the money than we would have understood him to be. But we see again, and as I said to you a few minutes ago, we see this increased sophistication of ideas. Once one philosopher starts, everyone else starts building on it. Now, what I want to do is I want to move on to a philosopher called Anaximander. So yeah, that's the one. That's the slide. Now, we'll ignore that for a second. So Anaximander 610 to 547 BC. He was a friend of Thales. He knew Thales. We know that from previous things, and that's all we have. Of Anaximander's writings. Just that 4 lines. But out of those 4 lines, we can get so much. Again, why? So we'll fill in the blanks in some ways in terms of what Anaximander has to say about the nature of the universe. Well, he was going to take things a step further than Thales, because whereas Thales said everything was water, Anaximander said, yeah, I get where you're coming from, Thales, but it's a little bit more complex than that. And again, remember I was talking about increased sophistication as the ideas progress. Again, with the understanding that the universe is something that we can look at as being an ordered and systematic place. So Anaximander had said, Thales, right to a certain extent, water is hugely important, but Anaximander is sitting at, again, as Thales did, in Miletus, on the edge of the known Greek world at the time, at a port in an arid country where he's looking at the 4 elements, always constantly battle it out: earth, air, fire, water. So sun battles with it, air battles with that, so the fire battles with the air battles with the sea, tides. You can see where he's coming from. All of the 4 principles, earth, air, fire, and water, on a coast, because it's about what he sees around him. On a coast, earth, air, fire, and water are in constant battle. So fire and water are in constant battle. So water, the fire of the sun dries the water. So one takes from the other. That the tides going in and out, water and earth are battling it out. And therefore, he says, everything in the universe, he said, is made of earth, air, fire, and water. And then he does something extraordinary, because his thought processes go one step forward. Because as he observes earth, air, fire, and water toing and froing in this dynamic interchange back and forward, he realizes something. And for him, what he realizes was that ultimately none of these 4 principles actually seem to be in charge. Not one of these 4 principles of earth, air, fire, and water were actually dictating. So earth wasn't dictating to the other 3. Fire wasn't dictating to the other 3. Water wasn't dictating. They all seem to be in this 4-way to and fro dance of the nature of the universe. And that leads Anaximander to a hugely important leap in European thinking. One would argue in world thinking, because he says there has to be something else at play here. But he says, I can't see it. He says there has to be something else that is governing the things that we can see. But we can't hear it. We can't feel it. We can't see it. We can't touch it. And Orly, if you go back to Anaximander there. So let's, before we go on to that, let's come back to these 4 lines we have, right? Think of it now. He said earth, air, fire, and water are constantly in play. And he tells us that existing things perish into those things out of which they have come to be, as must be. So that's an important line. Existing things perish into those things out of which they have come to be. So nothing gets destroyed, he's saying. So the tide comes in, water takes from earth, tide goes out, earth takes from water. They seem to perish, but they're not actually perishing. Existing things perish into things out of which they have come to be, as must be. Now, that's a really interesting line. As must be. Not out of chance, not out of a god deciding by happenstance or just because the god was bored that would change into that, or the tide was not in control of Poseidon, the god of war of the sea. Is these things perish into things out of which they have come to be, as must be. As must be for what? What is it dictating as must be? Science, a theory of natural law. He's nearly there with that idea of a natural law. Now, the second line is even more interesting. For they pay reparation to each other for their injustice. Now, that's an interesting one, because this is Anaximander attempting to break away from the gods. And we see that with an awful lot of the early pre-Socratic thinkers, is that they're attempting to articulate a new idea of the nature of the universe that was rational, ordered, it was using reason, predictability, systematic thinking, but yet they're still caught in a language of the gods. Because, see that line, for they pay reparation to each other for their injustice. We would never talk about, we would say, a tsunami happens, hundreds of thousands of people are killed, an earthquake happens, a volcano explodes, a tragic event, and people will die. But we would never call it a great injustice. We would never call it evil. We don't say, if the newspapers or the TV are reporting an earthquake somewhere or a volcano erupting, they don't say that evil earthquake. Why? Because evil and injustice and all of these are very human concepts and human ideas and human values. But, so why does Anaximander use them? Because Anaximander is still living in a world of the gods. And that's how he needs to explain it to everyone else. He's attempting to break away from the gods, because it's not as if suddenly when Thales begins to think, everyone turns into a scientist overnight. This happens over hundreds and hundreds of years, that these philosophers are beginning to attempt to break away from the idea of the gods, because it's embedded in human culture. The Greek culture that all of these early philosophers are living in is the culture of the gods. It's ingrained in people. So Anaximander himself, now you can take two kind of views on this. Is Anaximander using the language of the gods because he knows he has to explain this to his peers as such, to other people who are maybe not into philosophy, and priests and priestesses and people in power? So we do it by we explain things by analogy anyway, don't we? I mean, and that's perhaps what he's at. I mean, if so think of a film that's on the cinema, or something on Netflix, you're going to recommend to a friend, and they'll go, oh, did you see X? Did you see such and such? And you should really click onto that on Netflix, or go to the cinema to see that. Well, what's it like? Well, it's like if you put that with that. So you explain the film that the other person hasn't seen by likening it to something else. Oh, so it's like everyone. A friend of mine was talking about Nosferatu the other day, and I hadn't seen Nosferatu yet, and I asked my friend, "Well, what's it like?" Well, it's like if you crossed an old Dracula movie with something with Quentin Tarantino or something like that, right? So we do it by analogy. Anaximander's kind of doing the same. He's analogizing because he knows in some ways that he has to communicate these very, very new ideas to an audience that's used to the gods. So he lets it slip in those 4 lines that we have. For they pay a reparation to each other for their injustice according to the ordinance of time. Because in Greek folklore, in the Greek culture of the gods, if one god stole from another god, the council of the gods would gather together and try and ease things between them, and there was a reparation. Well, you stole that from that god, so that god has to get that. And that was very common in Greek culture, in the Greek culture of the gods. So ultimately, Anaximander is using that in order to explain. So he's attempting to break away from the gods. And it's interesting because if you look at that line, for they pay reparation to each other for their injustice, according to the ordinance of time. Now, again, that's a hugely important key for us with the notion of Anaximander, because Anaximander is telling us that, again, it's according to the ordinance of time. So go back to the first line. Existing things perish into things out of which they have come to be, as must be. So in some ways, if you want the two phrases within those few lines of Anaximander we've got that tell us that he's beginning to think differently about the world, about the nature of things, it's as must be and according to the ordinance of time. So things change when they change, as must be, because the laws of nature say so. Again, things change, the reparations to according to the ordinance of time. So if you want to use the kettle analogy that we were using earlier on, if you want to put it into the mouth of the gods, so the god of air steals from the god of water, turning it into steam, and they must pay reparations. But now what Anaximander is saying, that's done according to the ordinance of time. So the kettle will boil when it's good and ready, when the laws of nature suggest and dictate that it is, not the whim of a god, not the haphazardness of anything else, but the systematic and ordered nature of the universe. So these guys are beginning to think in a different way entirely. But come back to what Anaximander had said, because Anaximander, remember, he had said earth, air, fire, and water were battling it out together, that no one principle seemed to be in charge. But he makes a logical leap. And this, again, we're talking about it earlier, and we're referring back to it now, is that it's this logical inference that there must be something something exists that we can't see, we can't feel, we can't hear, we can't touch it. It never appears to us. But the dance of earth, air, fire, and water in this cosmic balancing act can only exist if that thing that we can't see is actually there, that it's existing. And he will call that the aperon in Greek, the aperon. Or if you can flick to that, yes, there we go, the aperon. Now, in Greek, peras meant a limit or a boundary, right? So you could define things. If things have a limit and a boundary, you can define it. So in terms of, say, even kind of, this is my desk, this is my office, this is my piece of land, because there's a boundary and a limit to it. If you talk about something as having an aperas, there's, i.e., if you're apolitical, you're not interested in politics, there's no limit. The aperon is essentially the unlimited. And the aperon, translated into English properly, as accurately as we can, simply comes up with the idea in English of stuff. Now, reputedly, Aristotle tells us that Anaximander went away for decades. Once he had figured out earth, air, fire, and water, he went away, and for decades he thought about it and came back with stuff. Now, you could be a little underwhelmed with that stuff. So he goes away, thinks about things for decades, and he comes back, yeah, universe is made of stuff. But he's being clever. Because stuff, what do we call, when do we use the word stuff? Well, we use the word stuff when we don't know what we're talking about. And because an examiner says we can't hear it, feel it, see it, touch it, therefore we can't give it a name. It's impossible to give it a name. So he does say we know from Aristotle that he says, look, I'm calling it the aperon, but that's a name that stands in for something that can not really be named. But we need to name it because we live in a world of limits and boundaries and phenomena, things that we can hear, feel, see, and touch. That which we can't hear, feel, see, or touch, we have to call the stuff of the universe. And this stuff of the universe, he says, again, repeat, we can't hear it, feel it, see it, touch it, but he creates this logical inference. And what I mean by a logical inference is, he says, and this is the first time we ever see it within Western thinking, ancient Greek thinking, is this idea that logically it has to be there. Even though there's no evidence for it, stuff doesn't make sense. The universe does not make sense if this thing isn't there. Now, again, you could sit back and you could think to yourself, that's just bonkers. That's a bonkers idea. But think about it. I don't know whether you would have learned about it in secondary school, but the thing called the Large Hadron Collider. This is a massive science experiment that's going on in Europe, and they bury this massive tube, I think several kilometers in a circle, and what they're doing is they're smashing protons and neutrons at each other. And what they think is that if they see these things happen, and they've now done the experiment, that what they think they'll see for milliseconds is evidence of what they call the Higgs boson field. And the Higgs boson field, interestingly enough, scientists also call the Higgs boson field the God particle, because the Higgs boson field is the assumption that the universe has to make sense only if the Higgs boson field is there. So it's the glue, it's the stuff that holds together. Because for quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and they know that one of the freaky things about the nature of the universe is that matter should not be sticking together. You, me, everything in the universe that is material, there's no good reason for that to stick together, to stay. So your cup, the room, me as a human being, all of the different matter that came together to create me shouldn't stick together. And it only should stick together if there's something that we can't hear, feel, see, or touch. The dark matter as such of the universe that makes that which we can see sensible. So ultimately, Anaximander has developed an incredibly sophisticated idea of the universe. The idea that there must be something, and it's an interesting thing because he sets in train in some ways an obsession in Western thinking, because we call it the monistic assumption. Mono, single. The assumption that one thing engineers all other things. That it's one thing. So and that's embedded to culture. So if you jump over to a theology class, or it's one, at this moment in time, we see the transition from many gods to the emergence of one God. Whether that be, whether that be Buddha, whether that be Jesus, whether that be the Judaic understanding, it's one God, Yahweh. Interestingly enough, Yahweh it was the old Aramaic and Hebrew name for God. Yahweh. What does Yahweh mean? I am who am. So when Moses in the burning bush asks the burning bush, "Who are you?" God says, "I am Yahweh." In other words, I am who am. In other words, mind your own business. I'm unlimited. I'm God. I'm the aperon. So we see this emergence then into the monistic assumption at this point in time. And I honestly don't think it is down to pure coincidence that we see the emergence of monotheistic religions at the time when, in 600 odd BC, we are beginning to see in Greek philosophy the emergence of the idea of a monistic assumption, that all things lead back to one thing. So for Anaximander, it was the apeiron. It was this unseen stuff of the universe that makes sense of all of the other stuff. And of course, that's bedded into culture. I mean, I was watching Lord of the Rings again. It came up on one of the TV channels the other day, and of course, the abiding principle of the Lord of the Rings is that there is what? One ring to rule them all. One ring to rule them all. In the same way as the apeiron is the one stuff to rule earth, air, fire, and water, the one, and eventually then the one God to rule everything. So we see the emergence of this idea of a monistic assumption, this logical inference that there has to be something else we can't see that dictates what we do see. And that's one of the amazing things that Anaximander articulates is this idea, because we would see it now. I mean, we know in modern science, everything we do see comes down to an atomic level. So protons, neutrons, atoms, molecular stuff, everything is there. Everything that we can't see dictates what we do see. So again, this is ordered and systematic. So what we see with Anaximander, the same as we saw with Thales, these first two pre-Socratic thinkers, we see them in some ways breaking all the rules. They're breaking all the rules of the gods. And why? Because they want to be able to see the world as a rational, ordered place. Something, and if you see the world as a rational and ordered place, you can create, for want of a better word, civil society. You can create the idea of predictability, of system, of order, but more importantly, in terms of humans, that human agency is returning now to you. So one of the great benefits of this switch, this kind of revolution in ancient Greek philosophy in rejecting the idea of the gods, was a return to the idea of a meaningful existence for you. You were now, it's the birth it's not too much, I think, to say that this is the beginning of the birth of the self, because it is the idea that you are now in charge. There may be an ordered, systematic universe, but your future isn't determined by the random chances of a god, because they're now being rejected. So that idea that your life is out of your control returns back to you. Now things are within your control, according to, as Anaximander said, the ordinance of time. I can't escape the laws of physics, but within the realm of the law of physics, we are in control of our own lives. And I suppose there's an element of this that, so in some ways, how does this begin? Apart from the stuff that I was talking about at the start of the talk, one of the things I think is hugely important is that in and around this time, 600 BC, 500 BC, we get the invention of something that I think is incredibly important. And that's papyrus, paper. Because up until that point in time, the mythology and culture of the gods was ultimately an oral tradition. And what I mean by that is that it's ultimately stories told in gatherings of human beings. So it's oral. You're depending on your memory, depending on you're depending on your recollection. And of course, in the retelling, I can guarantee you, someone says something to you in class today, by the end of the day, it'll have turned into something else. That's how great gossip starts, yeah? Is that someone says something to someone else, and by the end of the day, it's gone round the school and it's morphed out of all existence. And ultimately, I think that was the nature of what we would refer to as the Homeric tradition. So the stories of Homer, the great Homeric tales, were told orally. But if you now write those down, this was in before the invention of papyrus. And if you now, so these reeds, so this began in Egypt when they began creating paper from the reeds that were growing on the side of the River Nile. If you begin the task of writing, you can now put things down on paper. If you put things down on paper, you can go away, reflect. You don't have to remember, oh God. So, for instance, what you're doing, this is in the modern digital world, this is a version of writing. Truly, because you can click onto this, your teacher's going to make this available to you, and you can click on this and you can go, oh yeah, no, what was Noel saying? And you can go back, and if you can go back and identify, rather than your memory of it that may be mistaken or whatever, then you can actually then critically engage. And I think it's hugely important that it can't be a coincidence that the invention of papyrus and the birth of Greek philosophy happens at the same time. Because if you write things down, you can critically engage, you can look back, and you can exercise your critical engagement about things. Great book, actually, that I picked up only recently, by Irene Vallejo, and it's called Papyrus. It's a great read for any student. It bounces along, it doesn't get too heavy, but it's in some ways it is essentially the invention of writing in the ancient world. And it's for those of you doing classical studies, it's a really great book to kind of, and it goes to the question that I was asking at the end. I don't think it's a coincidence. I can't see it as a coincidence that the birth of Greek philosophy and the birth of paper and writing happens at the same time.
So, unless you have any finishing words, Noel, this will conclude the lecture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Done.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.